After that, Rose and her mother spent the rest of the day together. Rose's mother, one by one, began to show her how to use the ability to grow and control nature, to control the growth, to become what she wanted it to be. And Rose at least felt like she had a knack for it, almost feeling as if it came naturally to her. Her mother regularly told her not to be frustrated if it seemed difficult, but for whatever reason, it never did, always feeling as if it came naturally. And she rapidly became capable of creating a very wide array of things. She found that what was most important was not a visual image, but a desire when it came to altering things, rather than having to understand any sort of specific structure or even how plants work. All she had to do was simply have a desire. If she wanted a plant that would draw water from the ground and produce fresh, clean water to drink, all she had to do was think about the desire, and the plant would simply do the rest. She didn't need to understand how it worked. It was as if nature itself understood and would simply create a plant to fit the need. Rose could ask vines to move things for her, to pick her up off the ground, create a walkway, or create something soft to sit on. Basically, anything she could think of, and she was having a great deal of fun playing around with it. There were a few points where she thought her lackadaisical attitude towards using the abilities might offend her mother's sensibilities. However, it didn't seem to bother her mother at all, no matter what she desired from the plants, or how silly it seemed. Her mother simply smiled and enjoyed watching Rose use her abilities. Eventually, it did start to bother her, though, as Rose turned to her mother. Mom? Aren't sky rays supposed to be protectors of nature or something like that? You don't think it's a bit selfish to use my powers just to create something soft to sit on, or something pretty for the sake of being pretty? Rose's mother simply laughed a bit. Well, of course not. It doesn't really matter what you create, Rose. It isn't like with modern technology, where you have to destroy things in order to make yourself comfortable, or pollute the environment, abuse resources, and generally make the world a worse place. Regardless of what you create with your abilities, Rose, whether it seems silly or not, what you're creating is life, a living, breathing thing. And regardless of what form that life takes, it can never be bad. Such is the nature of life. So create whatever you want. Such is simply your right as a Sky Ray. Well, okay, Rose replied. So I can basically use these powers to make anything, right? Yes, Rose, her mother replied. At that point, Rose got an interesting expression on her face, as if a thought occurred to her. Well, because one did. She wondered how far she could push that, exactly how complicated it could be to create something, and how complicated that something could be. Without any hesitation, Rose simply knelt down, placing her hands on the ground, and finding a nice seed beneath her, upon which she began to focus her intent, a desire, a strong one that she had had for some time. And just as all the times before, Rose began to feel a warmth in the palm of her hands, the energy beginning to build. And then suddenly, she felt an overwhelming warmth that seemed to fill her entire body. A warmth that seemed more intense than anything that she had tried to produce before. Even the tree paled in comparison. "Rose, what are you doing?" her mother said, sounding concerned as Rose felt the rush of energy leave her. And suddenly, Rose felt dizzy, a bit lightheaded, beginning to teeter a bit from left to right. Her mother rushed over to her, grabbing her by the shoulders. "Rose? Are you okay, Rose?" she shouted, beginning to move strands of hair away from her face and look her over. Yeah, Mom. I'm sorry, I just got a bit dizzy." It was at that point that they began to see a seed sprouting just a few inches in front of Rose. A seed that quickly began to develop a bud, like a large flower bud, growing, getting larger. It grew until it was about the size of a basketball. And then, from within this bud, they began to see light peering out from beneath flowery petals. And for a few moments it sat like that, the rosebud actually beginning to pulsate as if it were a heartbeat, throbbing from one moment to the next. "Rose, what did you do?" "I just used my abilities. You said that it would take the form of my desires, right? I just asked for something that I've always wanted." "Yes, Rose, but what did you ask for?" her mother said, looking at her somewhat concerned. And it was at that moment that the flower bud began to open, the petals spreading out. There was a slight poof as specks of pollen burst out into the air around it, as the flower petals spread out, opening wide to reveal a small fluff ball sitting in the center, which Rose and her mother stared at in amazement as it suddenly began to move, shifting ever so slightly, before hoisting itself up and rolling out of the center of the flower bud. In short order, they began to see legs, small, fluffy little legs. They were yellow in coloration, the same as the flower, the same as the fluff that covered them. And out from this fuzzy little puffball, with those 4 legs sticking out, also protruded a head, and then a little puffy tail, as it rolled about on the ground, finally stammering its way to its feet, bouncing around a bit, before a very familiar noise chimed out from the creature. A bark, a tiny, adorable little bark, as the tiny little puffball rushed over to Rose, jumping in her lap, looking up at her and giving off tiny little cute barks. It was a dog, a fluffy yellow dog, with big green eyes that simply stared up at Rose through the fluff ball of a face it had. "Rose, I can't believe it," her mother said, looking down at the small creature. "It worked!" Rose shouted, as she pulled the small dog up into her arms, hugging it tightly and beginning to pet at it. "I can't believe it actually worked! Oh, you are so cute!" "Rose, how did you do that?" her mother said, still looking at her in astonishment. "Well, I just thought about it. I had always wanted a dog, but we could never get one. You said you were concerned, that you didn't want to have a pet. So I did what you told me to, and asked nature. And nature gave me you little puffball," Rose said, holding up the little yellow puffball of a dog. Or at least she thinks it's a dog. At least dog-like, she thought, as she stared up at it. It sat there in her hands, a small green tongue sticking out, panting a little bit, letting off a few more small barks. "Rose," her mother said, "that shouldn't be possible." "What?" Rose replied. "Rose, making living things of a complex nature, like an animal, it's beyond the normal abilities of a sky ray. We can make plants that do a great number of things, but the more complicated something is, the greater the energy that is required to create it. Creating something with sentience, something like what you've just created, it takes an amount of energy that no sky ray possesses. Even if there were a dozen of us, what you've just created probably still wouldn't be possible. It doesn't make any sense, Rose. Creating something that has that much life essence to it, it's a daunting task. The energy of a normal sky ray would fall short long before being capable of doing it. And yet, you did," Rose's mother said as she reached out, beginning to pet the small, dog-like creature. "It's amazing, wondrous even," she said, petting it gently. "Perhaps it's your father's influence that makes it possible. I don't know how that would be, but it's the only thing that I can surmise. You, Rose, are extraordinary. You possess power unlike anything I have ever seen. This is amazing," she said as she wrapped her arms around Rose, hugging her tightly. "I always knew that you would be special. I really shouldn't have been so surprised."